that the shadow isn't bad. It only gets troublesome when you don't examine its consequences. Lots of important things happen in the shadow. The shadow is the place where we grow, where we experience rebirth, or the womb, a place of darkness, but it's also a place of rebirth. And I think that's important because working on the shadow, identifying the shadow, recognizing the shadow, but also working on the shadow is a potentially transformative experience. The trouble is that if you think it's all light and no shadow, you're really just going to keep intensifying the light every time someone points out the shadow to you. So my favorite story about that is 2007, Steve Jobs pioneers what will become a kind of genre of things in Silicon Valley called the product release. And in this case, it's the smartphone. And he's on a stage. And if any of us have been around the kind of history of televangelist preachers, there was a certain way in which he sort of resembled the onstage preacher with the spotlights coming in. And instead of waving a Bible, he's waving the iPhone. And the way the spotlights are set up on the stage, there's no shadow.
So we've made this metaphor so far in the conversation about individuals and their choices and their relationship with the shadow. I just suddenly wondered if there's a larger metaphor of shadow across the entire society. Like, are we all starting to go as a culture approach a midlife crisis or a breaking relationship, or in some way having that shadow that's grown within our society now reach the point where we have to recognize it?
There's sort of some familiar places. Social media is one of them. The polarization that's built into social media, the way in which social media is monetized on attention. So it's like built to keep you there as long as you can. And so then it works kind of like the potter's hand on the clay. The pressure may be gentle, but it's shaping who we are, and it's shaping us in ways that we don't want to become. So that, social media is a big one we talk about.
Yeah. Barry, what do you think?
Well, in time, the shadow shows itself. I'm watching a city over the 35 years we've lived here really be on a cutting edge that I feel like is going to play out in other parts of our own country and world as we watch the accumulation of great wealth or people that have access to technology separate and create gap between people that don't have access to it or can't afford it. And what to do with that as a society when is some awareness that could be going on, the guilt, or if you will, the shame of that. What do you do with that gap as a group of people? It's not like technology is heartless, but it doesn't know how to deal, nor does it have tools or language to deal with its own shadow. And yet it's recognizing it's waking up in a world where the people who don't have access to that are feeling, quote, left behind. What I'm seeing is that we keep believing that we just need to keep going further in the direction we have been pursuing, that somehow technology will fix technology's own problems. And it's just a matter of getting everybody a computer. But it still fails to address what we're calling the shadow work. And so that's where I pause to watch a city kind of lost, because in our own smart and intelligence, our tools are incredibly capable of taking care of almost every social ill that we can begin to name. And yet we're not arriving at those places as a group of people. There's enough food for everyone to eat. There's enough water for everyone to have something clean. There's enough ways to teach everyone how to read. And we have spiraling numbers of people that are not eating, that are not housed. Our tools have never been better. Our needs have never been greater. That gap is mystifying cities like the one I love and live in. What is this concept of the shadow, and why is it going to be there until we turn inward to begin to address it? That's the work I think we've got to do together.
And in the work you do you see tech executives who are suffering from shadow that come to you and, are dealing with some sort of moral crisis or shadow crisis? And if so, how do they deal with it?
Yeah, I see it often. It's not really at the beginning, because the beginning, you want to know what it is that you're trying to bring into the world. And a lot of young people that are drawn to this time, to the city, to the valley, have great hearts. They actually want to put meaning into their work again. They're inexperienced, so they have a huge passion. And they have very few templates of people in front of them. The eldership is not in front of them because the world they've inherited doesn't have people over profit. It's a world that has had profit over people. So here's a new generation of leaders coming into technology, coming to the Valley, hoping to impact the world in a positive way. And they get started with little ahead of them to learn from. And matter of fact, they're suspect of what has been developed by business and companies in front of them because it hasn't helped the world much. So they come with great big giant hearts, we might say. They're awake to their passion. They are educated in a new generation of science and technology. They begin to have the language of entrepreneurs. And keep in mind, going back to this a couple of times, this cuts them off from most people that are their models and their elders, because those elders didn't come through this way. So they're pioneers and pilgrims, these young people are in their own right. With heavy-duty world problems, they've got technology now, but in their own interior life, they're underdeveloped for the problems they're trying to serve, especially in the significant power of the technology that is at their fingertips. Huge problems like the world's never seen, the power of tools we've never held before, and yet the human psyche of that young leader as undeveloped as ever. That is the chemistry of a shadow. I should be able to fix the problem. The problem has me up at night and it affects my loved ones and the world I live in. I should be able to make a difference in the world because no one's held this technology that I now hold. I'm the first generation to hold a phone that can communicate through the entire world. Why isn't this working for me at a level of success and impact? And they don't have the tools to understand it's not a matter of the technology or the scale of need. It's a matter of the undeveloped interior life of that person who has everything ready for them except what is most important, a centered, a grounding in which you can move the world. Gaiman, who was it? Was it Achilles, or I can't remember who it was? It said, give me a fulcrum, give me a point where I can leverage and I can move the whole world. I mean, you would think technology is that fulcrum point for one individual now to move a massive amount of people over a tremendous global hurdle. We have the tools, but I think it's a lack of the Valley and any industry that doesn't have the interior catch up to the exterior opportunities that they've been granted. It's haunting. It's despairing. It's a new kind of anxiety and stress on a young person. And we're kind of befuddled as to what to do with this.
Samara, I just am thinking back of when I first met you and we embarked on making a documentary about the power of gene editing and how it was going to be the next revolution. I mean, we have the agricultural revolution, the IT revolution, and now biotech is going to give us almost total control over nature and our own biology, solve all disease. I mean, it's a tremendous technology. But I'm curious if you can take us into the world that you were in that lab.
I listened to Barry, and it's all about, we cultivate our ability to innovate, to build new things, to answer new questions, to what I call engineer or hack the nature or biology. But we spend so little time on understanding who we are as human beings, and and validate that or cultivate that in our culture. And you spend so many hours in the lab, inside the lab, and so little at home. I was thinking that I was becoming more hollow from inside. And I was thinking that I'm just like, my soul is dying. I didn't know who I was. And even the type of person I was in the lab was not the one that I inherently wanted to be. Those were not my values. Those were the values of the system that I was a product of. Biotech, similar to digital revolution, is poised to transform our lives. And I want to ask Barry and Gaiman to at least speculate for us what could be the shadow of biotech. Gaiman, do you want to start to give us some example of that?
Yeah, I want to say a couple of things, Samir, about what you just said, which was really powerful in your own story and in your own experience. If you work in the tech industry, there's too much to do. And you're constantly confronted by problems that are more or less uninteresting problems, whether they're a technical problem or a sales problem or a product management problem. But those relatively uninteresting problems for which there's not enough hours of the day to work on them are constantly situated on an ever receding horizon that tells you if you just get through this stuff, like you're going to produce something that makes the world a better place, or you're going to produce something that's going to give you a greater sense of personal fulfillment. But of course, it's not clear whether or not you ever get there, which is not to say that technology is all bad. I hope that no one's hearing in what we're talking about the idea that like we don't need technology, but rather we tend to underestimate the extent to which the one who's doing the work on the technology is going to shape the technology. And the work that technology does on us is going to shape our lives as we go about the business of trying to build these technologies. Okay, that sounds abstract and vague in a certain kind of way. Said more plainly, the life we're living when we make this stuff has a lot to do with what the stuff is and becomes. And as Samir is saying, if we don't have time in our lives to think about how to be centered, to think about the kinds of meaning that we want in our lives, then we go on being these people who are just running after the next blue ribbon in our career development, trying to finish the next set of tasks. And the technology we make is, at least in part, made in the image of that culture of constant striving and the constant attempt to get ahead. And the, if you will, deeper questions of who we are and how we get centered that Barry just mentioned, they don't have a place. So, Samir, you said you feel like you don't have the time for these things. And you're absolutely right. You don't have the time for these things. Now, one more thought, and I'll hand it over to Barry. Curiously, things like spiritual practices are all over the place in the tech industry. A couple years ago, there was a kind of famous / notorious moment in which Jack Dorsey, then the CEO of Twitter, founder of Twitter, CEO of Twitter, started tweeting about the fact that he was fasting. Okay, fasting is like one of the oldest spiritual practices. Well, it turns out he was fasting not because he wanted to reach enlightenment or get in touch with his higher self or whatever. He was fasting because he could control his metabolism in such a way that he could work more optimally. And so, on the one hand, we see the presence of spiritual practices in the form of the wellness industry, if you will, all over the place in technology. But too often, it's there because people are trying to optimize their ability to work more creatively, to work more effectively. And so instead of these spiritual practices being the thing that slows you down to take up the work on yourself, they've actually been put into the service of ever increasing acceleration. And simply, they end up simply reinforcing the very problems that Samira just named.
No, I love it, Damon. I mean, there is a gutted culture inside of technology that is contained or kept in the shadow. And a gutted culture meaning there's not a language, it seems, that technology is using to have this conversation of opening up what it's lacking, what it's missing, and seeing it. It feels humiliating to any industry. So they have to be corrected from outside of themselves, which is always unfortunate. Another example, when the church doesn't examine its own self, the world examines the church and shows it's lacking in what it says it's here to do. Since the Enlightenment, science and technology we've placed on the shoulder of science and now technology, all of our ills, acting as if they should now be godlike. They've tried to make a public promise that by being good technologists, they're good for all of our diseases. They're going to clean up everything that we lack. We've heightened them to the point where they don't know how to tell us they can't, at least up to this point. it's not just on them. It's tough right now to be a scientist. It's tough right now to be a technologist because the world so looks on us like it used to look on religion, which is save us, redeem us, fix our problems. And science is following the same steps that religion fell when it came off of its divine throne in the world's eyes, which meant that it didn't know what to do with its own shadow. So it holds both a shadow inside of itself, and yet the world looks on it with a shadow that the world possesses because the world doesn't want to look and take responsibility. It just wants to cast its own expectations onto technology. So hopefully I've said that clear enough to say that this is an interesting time in our own consciousness as a group of people, finding ourselves at this point in history still haunted, not by so much what we've made, but what continues to be unshaped within us that's necessary for the human journey. We continue to externalize what needs to be brought to the clarity of our internal process and work as people. How do we confess? How do we process experiences that are shaping our lives so that we quit trying to save ourselves with pseudo messiahs and false means of what, what's going to make the future better. And this isn't to try to put, despair and sad sack at the center of the conversation. There just needs to be ownership by all of us to know, how do we open shadow to realize that when you open the shadow, you find a spring of creativity that actually brings forward more response for what's needed in the world than if you keep that shadow sealed and undiscussed. So I'm kind of opening up another part of what the shadow can do. When we open up the shadow and we let it really begin to be known to us, it's a new source of creativity that actually outperforms the doubling down of our strengths. Inside the shadow is the creativity the world needs to heal itself. And we refuse to look inside the shadow. We keep betting on doubling up our strengths.
So there is a lot of power in acknowledging the shadow. But in a culture which is not based on, this, how do we incentivize acknowledging the shadow?
Well, for me, first half of life is all about, getting my strengths down and letting people get acquainted with me through the strengths that I can bring, whatever I apply myself to. So that works until I encounter something that my strengths are not great enough to solve. And then I go into irons right there. I'm not sure what to do because now I've got my strengths, but they're not quite up to what it is that I'm facing. And it's at that pivot point that I begin to ask new questions of myself, maybe at a deeper level, something beyond just what am I strong at. But in the second half of life, I think we move from a strength-based to more of what I might want to call a centered-based life. And a centered-based life is not just what I'm good at, what I'm paid for, but it asks me to be a little more self-aware of what it is that I don't see. It provides me a humility that my strengths could never give me. I can begin to see that I need others. I can begin to see that I can creatively look at a situation sometimes better without my strengths informing me constantly. I can see it from a new position.
Yeah, I'm still back on the word incentivize. I don't know if we need to incentivize. I worry that activates the wrong stuff, in part because I think there's already a commitment to the idea, however unexpressed, a commitment to the idea in technology that there's nothing to be given up by addressing these issues. And I think there's a lot that has to change if you do this kind of shadow work. I think the kind of forces, economic and political and kind of careerist forces that drive the tech industry are not unlike other places in life. Like, this isn't just a tech problem. But tech does hold a particular place in the world today because of its reach and its power and its allure and the rest of it. And I think there are lots of people who work on tech and work with tech that are hungry for more meaning, both in their own lives and in their own careers, but also in the work that they're doing and in the outcomes of the work that they're doing. I don't know that it needs to be incentivized. I think there just needs to be some kind of commitment to a deeper transformation of the cultures within which we're doing this work.
Samara, what was your transition like? You come to see the shadow. What was it like for you personally?
For me, this idea of like acknowledging the shadow was possible only when I slowed down my outwardly progress, when I went against the flow of the culture, which is push hard, spend lots of hours in the lab, publish paper, bring lots of grant money, and focus your attention there. In order for me to do the shadow work, I needed to slow down and prioritize other things. And that meant, at least kind of in a short term, obviously in a long term might be different, but in a short term, sacrificing my success according to the definition of my peers. And I think when I say incentivize, what was my incentive doing that? I think I was so tired. I was not at peace with myself, and I think I could make that decision.
Your very survival was almost on the line.
Exactly.
Yeah, Samira, your story is so important to clarifying all of this. I don't think that the way these industries work can survive in its current form if it prioritizes the things that you've prioritized in your life, Samira. A willingness to slow down and even exit if the life of self-care and meaning and purpose and joy can no longer be fit within the confines of our professional lives. My ears perk up at a word like incentivize because I worry that lots of these industries are going to try to build in a bit more meditation and a bit more yoga as a way of not really addressing the underlying issue, which is an old issue. Can you have your cake and eat it too? I think the technology industry has really set forth a culture that tries to make powerful things, but also make life better, as it were.
I agree with you. And Gaiman, that meant that I had to resign from my tenured position, because a lot of times my colleagues didn't recognize this as necessary work. Fortunately, I had the courage to do that. But a lot of people's livelihood is dependent on the job they have, right? And that's their whole life. So they don't do that exit that I did.
The ability to exit from a culture or a set of institutions that are really killing your soul is a privilege of a certain kind of professional class. What if you're, taking care of not only yourself, but your family or your parents or whatever it may be? There is a kind of luxury even in the conversation.
You just can't keep up with the pace of the best because we're confused what is best and we're running at accelerated speeds. I think you've got to slow down. But I've also seen people slow down only to become haunted with why they were keeping up such a hectic pace in the first place. And that is they didn't have a center. They didn't have an inner cadence by which their own authenticity was being tuned towards. They were living their life by keeping up with the pace of the world around them, and it was exhausting. And I think there's this fear of coming away from the pace the world requires to slow down because we're haunted by a lack of center. So I think it's pace, but I also think there has to be a conversation held within oneself about who am I? What do I have it in me to be? What is authentic about the story I'm living in? And that's where, when Gaiman is saying, that's a heavy conversation to have by myself in the bedroom, right? But that's why these spiritual, perennial wisdom type practices are so needed, because you aren't sitting there alone when you do that. You actually can become accompanied with a great group of sages, others that have lived those questions well. And now you open up a conversation with them, finally at the center of your life. And now you're not just being formed by the generation you're being formed by a much larger human conversation that's really important to have, which is learning from others. Speed and as centered is what we're looking for as we're talking to people who are experiencing this exhausting pace of the world.
Gaiman, do you remember before we started recording, I asked you about biotech and what the shadow would look like, and I asked, is bioterrorism an example of the shadow? And
When you're thinking about the, if you will, the dark side of biotechnology, the idea that there might be somebody out there who's going to do something bad with it is a legitimate fear, but it operates within the culture of biotech in a particular way. And in my opinion, it operates to shut down conversations about shadow work rather than to open them up. It introduces a certain kind of moral posture where you say, look, if there's a problem here, it's not a problem with me, it's a problem with them. And no doubt there is a problem with them. There's a little bit of truth to that, but it doesn't follow that there isn't also a problem with me. And in fact, I think a lot of the conversation around bioterrorism has functioned in the biotech community as a way of offloading the shadow work. That's in part because there's a kind of old myth of the idea that technology is basically neutral. But all of that tends, in my opinion, to function more often as a kind of deflection. It does that more than providing an opening to really grapple with the shadow side of things.
I'm just wondering what you guys think the consequences would be if the shadow work is not done in an industry like biotech. For example, with the computer revolution, yes, our computers are hacked and our credit cards are hacked and our economy is hacked or whatever, democracy is hacked. These are issues. But what are the issues of this actually taking place within our biology? Are we at like the next level here in terms of the stakes of what happens if we don't finally do this work as a culture?
Tech, high tech, digital tech is so much more familiar to us than biotech. The hyper optimization of businesses, even brick and mortar businesses, through AI and through the demand of the Wall Street Quarterly Report. These are all things we're familiar with, and we see how they drive inequality. We see how they exacerbate polarity in our relationships and in our communities, polarization. We see how they distract us, render us coarser in certain kinds of ways. They change what we pay attention to. They change what we love. They change what we give ourselves to, what we hope for, how we see ourselves, how we see others. So let us remember that one of the things that's happening in biotech is the machinery of optimization that has run the tech industry is going to run the biotech industry. So I don't know where the shadow side will show up. There are some places already that you all have paid attention to, the kind of desire for immortality, the desire to think about human physical limits as themselves a kind of pathology that maybe could be overcome if you just engineer well enough. If you can just fix each new mistake and every limit you encounter, you treat as the next opportunity to start a new business, to overcome a new limitation. But what all that looks like in practice, I don't know, except that it proposes to embed in our flesh the outputs of the very culture that we've already experienced on social media and in our politics. And it's going to be multi-generational. You have to have a culture of innovation that's willing to shut some things down. One of the options on the table is to not do things, to not develop certain capacities. But that's really hard because we have a kind of fatalistic relationship to innovation. If I don't do it, somebody's going to do it. We should have the expectation that the kinds of shadow problems that we've had to deal with tech will only be magnified by the significance of the fact that our very flesh will be rendered in the image of these tech cultures.
And now we go back into that perennial wisdom, a mindset that begins to know a conversation we have with ourselves interior about what is loving, what truly connects, what am I hungry for? Maybe even more expansive, what is this world asking of me? Ultimately, to aim the days of my life in response to. I think the preciousness of our lives is being put in front of us as we see the accelerated pace of technology. And the preciousness is something that needs to come away from the pace of the world, center itself in what is it to be essentially human. What does a human most want out of each day? We really want to connect with others and we want to be loving. that fulfills who we are in the world. It tells us we're not pieces of robotic responses to technology. It tells us we're more biologically wired to love and connect with one another. We want that in our workplace. We want that in our home lives. We want that in our personal space. It's a centering of all these disintegrated places that we send out into the world that recenters all of our parts into one whole person, tethered to love and a path that's practical to walk it out. To me, that's what we do with community and one another. And that's why we desperately need to recollect ourselves around a life that matters.
That was a fascinating conversation for me. They have seen so much and they have so much insight. Often it's things we all kind of feel like we already know, but when you hear it all come together, I mean, I'm just feeling like, I just kept feeling over and over like, yes, that is so true. I feel like I want to bring it back to biotech though. So what are the consequences of having a biotech wasteland? 9 out of 10 startups fail, and then the folks from the failed ones fall down in this wasteland of people who they very much want to succeed, but they haven't yet, and they're probably more and more desperate and maybe, willing to try anything, even some moral compromises just to move forward. And what happens when society begins to see through the tech shine and begin to vilify the biotech industry in the same way that they're doing right now with the social media companies? So the biotech revolution will be really far along at this point. The tools to manipulate viruses or create new animals or upgrade entire species of animals or just eliminate them or to change humans, these tools are going to be immensely powerful. And are they going to be in safer hands or just many, many more hands?
I know, Cody, but these are fantastic questions and we don't have the answer to them, but at least, as you mentioned, we need to start thinking about them.
So Samara, let's think about your personal story. I mean, the one that we started the episode with. So what would have happened if you never would have discovered that you actually want to make a personal change and 10 more years had gone by? Where would that have taken you and like the work that you were doing?
Personally, I think I would be totally burned out. I could potentially force myself to close my eyes to continue to move fast and absorb all the privileges and luxury that comes with it. But I think at some point I would be quite burned out and getting to a point where I start to question, what am I doing with my life? And would be quite depressed.
In some ways, your soul, for lack of a better word, may have been totally consumed at this point by work. And in that case, you're actually kind of sort of free of it, of reporting to it. You can see how folks get wrapped up in weapons programs or things that are only for personal advancement.
Or they may not feel that they should do it, but they don't stop and ask, okay, what's going on? Yeah, maybe I shouldn't.
Yeah, that's probably more accurate, actually. Well, this is a good time to wrap up for now. So what is our next episode?
We delve into how Hollywood films have shaped our perception or even the creation of genetic engineering. Ridley Scott's masterpiece, Blade Runner, was an inspiration for our film team during the entire process of making the documentary Make People Better. How is it that we so often set out to create the world we see in science fiction? We will sit down with leading sci-fi creators to probe how science fiction has such power to inspire or warn against possible futures, and how we can harness that power to create a future where gene editing technology is used responsibly.
Please support this podcast by sharing it and leave us a review. We would also love to add your voice to this conversation. We will be hosting a live discussion around this topic, and you're invited to join. Check the show notes for details. The Make People Better podcast is brought to you by the Random Good Foundation. Thanks, and we'll talk with you again soon.